All right, so the first lecture for tonight is going to be on configuration management or change management on these kinds of things. And so what we'll be talking about here is going to be about baselines, system baselines. You need to know what your baseline is before you can figure out how you're going to change things. And then how those requirements and configurations change and how you keep track of how those changes happen through that, and a variety of other things associated with that. So, um, so a baseline, when people talk about a baseline in project management, what they're talking about is a complete description including the requirements, designs, constraints, interfaces, team organization, responsibilities. All of that is in the baseline. It's basically the total description of how your project is supposed to work. All right. And so the reason why you have those baselines is that it helps keep everybody in communication, and that there is an agreement as to how it is that you're supposed to be proceeding with your development. Um, we've talked about these reviews, and that is where you establish and discuss your baseline. So the PDR, CDR, FRR, those are your baseline descriptions. They capture all these bits and pieces that are going into your project. And those baselines will change. You start off with a baseline, and then as you go through your phase, there will be deltas with it. There'll be changes, and so you measure what your changes are relative to those baseline. All right. So many times, when you go through a project, we talked about in the first lecture of this, we talked about the different phases: design, development, integration, etc. Well, there's another way, and typically NASA uses these things, which is phase A, B, C, D, E, and F. Okay, they use those and they define those as what is the associated baseline with it. So a pre-phase A is where you develop your sort of concept baseline. And then that leads into phase A, which gets you a functional baseline, et cetera, et cetera. So throughout all these phases, there is a different kind of baseline that gets developed and documented on that. So this slide sort of tells you what the definition of those baselines. So the functional baseline, or that which is established during phase A, is in essence the baseline that gets talks about the system function, its performance, its requirements, verifications, etc. Sort of what I was talking about last time as a pre-PDR. That's sort of where your phase A pre-PDR sort of is. After that is the design to baseline, all right, where you're going through more top level, you're refining your system and providing more detail as to how your development is. Notice that this one is established at the PDR level. So this is what I would be saying is leading up to the development phase. So the product baseline via the build to baseline, that's exactly sort of as I was talking about before. This is your menu, how it is that you're going to build your payload, and that's documented in the CDR. Likewise, after that, phase D is as built, how it is that you actually made it. You end up with your FRR, and finally the as deployed, or the flight operations, phase E. We actually don't get into that one too much. So these are the different kinds of phasing or baselines that you'll come to grips with as you go through your project and through the rest of your career if you're doing projects. This is just a diagram as to how these different baselines sort of evolve as you go through the project. So you you start off with your functional baseline here, and then as you go down through through your project, through the more detailed phases, you'll get more and more detail of what your instrument or your payload or your project is going to be. All right. And the other thing is that when you're going through these designs and developments, there's always going to be constraints. There's going to be your requirements, your design, your affordability. Now, in your case, it isn't so much, you might have actual real dollars involved in your affordability, but a lot of your constraint in a quote affordability unquote is going to be your time. So your time is divided by classes, which is the most important thing that you should be focusing on, and then work on this project. So your time associated with this project is a very valuable commodity, and you want to be very careful as to how you spend that time. You always want to spend your time effectively. So that has to come into your design configuration as well, is your affordability and how you're going to be allocating your time. You then have a schedule as also risk. We'll be talking about scheduling and risk management next time. All 5 of these need to be linked and tracked over the full project lifecycle. You need to be aware of where you are with all of these things. All right. So managing these requirements is something that you've got to do. All right. You can't just decide that, okay, well, we're done with that PDR, so we don't have to worry about it anymore. It's going to evolve. You need to manage it. You need to make certain that you're satisfying your requirements that you defined in PDR, et cetera. Plus, there are things that will change, right? And so that configuration management will help you keep track of all those changes and the requirements, et cetera, and help you be able to assure that your project is progressing correctly. So here's these different phases. And so as we go through sort of a concept studies initially, you'll end up with your problems, concepts, expectations. You're then evolving into your technology development. You're going to be using the testing your circuits, developing your system requirements. We talked about requirement validation. Preliminary design goes through and refines your concepts and your design specs. And then finally, you get to a point where you can design these things. So these are all the different kinds of phases that you would go through in a project. And at almost every point, there's changes that go on with that project. You usually it is not it is not usual that you define and have everything nailed down at this. You would like to get it as close as you can, but you aren't going to. There's always going to be changes going on. So you've got to be able to allocate time for managing those changes and keeping track of them. So how is it that you get these changes occurred? Well, you may be reallocating things, as your design matures. It could be the result of we talked about development, where you're testing a variety of different sensors or a variety of different circuits. You may have new requirements that it didn't occur to you earlier that you need to define. So that's a change. And your configuration may have to change as well. If something breaks, if you find out that a circuit is not what you expected it to be, then you're going to have to redesign that, rechange that configuration. Many times, so probably one of my favorite configuration change stories is when I had a student team that wanted to capture microbes in the stratosphere. And so they started off using pumps, all right, to pump the air through, right? I mean, we're here on the ground, we can do pumps. Well, what they found out is that almost all pumps don't work too well when you're in a vacuum or pretty close to a vacuum, right? And so they had to go through a completely different configuration change, where what they did was that they took their sampling devices and they actually moved it through the atmosphere. So rather than pumping atmosphere through their capture device, they actually moved their capture device through the atmosphere. And that's the way that they solved the problem. But that was a very different configuration than what was anticipated. All right. So change control and validation is something that you do need to make certain that you pay attention about what you're doing. You need to do things like if you're going to be doing boards, PCB boards or something like that, put labels on your PCBs when you make it so that you know which version of the PCB it is that you have your hands on it at a given time. A variety of other things like that. Software, different versions of your software should be the files should be labeled in a clear and concise fashion so that it's clear which version should be loaded on your payload and which one should not. All right. So those are all those kinds of things to look at. Um, this is sort of, you can look at this flow chart a little bit later on, and when you get some time, that sort of gives you some ideas about how to do your configuration control when you do these kinds of changes. And then later, this is another set. This is another example that that the later that you get into a project, the more expensive it is for a change to occur. And so making certain you get a necessary and a correct change in place is very, very important as you progress into the more mature a project is. Right. And so here's a little cartoon. So here's basically what this cart. You can read this cartoon, and basically usually this is used to illustrate things like you need to write things down. You need to communicate. So otherwise the goons will come and beat it out of you. All right. So communicating, putting together your documents is something that has to be done all the time with that.